From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
As Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warns, it's highly likely her department will not be able to pay the government's bills as early as June 1st if Congress doesn't act. A meeting at the White House this hour between President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy.
We'll sit down, we'll talk about that. But the underlying issue here is the Democrats, since they took the majority, has been addicted to spending.
Senator Tim Scott, meantime, joins the field of candidates for the Republican nomination for president.
I'm announcing today that I'm running for president of the United States of America.
That announcement just the start of a busy few days in politics, with another candidate set to enter the fray later on this week.
But we begin with the matter at hand, Kaylee, and that is solving the debt ceiling crisis. Interesting. One of the lead Republican negotiators, Congressman Patrick McHenry, North Carolina, says this needs to be done in about 24 hours. Here's what else he had to say.
There are a lot of obstacles for a deal, but we know the deadline, we know the challenge. People are working in good faith.
And this, of course, is after we said Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen really upped the ante, reiterating her view that it could be as early as June 1st that the U.S. is unable to meet all of its obligations. So this really just underscores the fact, Joe, that the clock is ticking.
That's for sure.
And we are talking hours and days, not a matter of weeks.
Another Monday, another letter.
Yeah.
It still says as early as June 1st. But clearly, this Treasury Secretary is telling Congress we can't make it through the middle of June. So something needs to happen now.
Well, we'll see if something further can happen today as we wait for this meeting to begin at the White House in just about 30 minutes' time. So let's bring in our panel now. Bloomberg politics reporter, national politics reporter Nancy Cook is with us, as well as Bloomberg's Enda Curran. So thank you both for being with us. Nancy, as we say, it's kind of go time at this point. So when we see them emerge from the Oval Office today, what happens if they say, we don't have a deal? How much time realistically do we have to work with otherwise?
Well, really, they have to start getting a deal moving, because even once they reach a deal, it still takes a little while to actually, hammer out all the details, firm them up. And then the lawmakers have to be here to actually vote on the deal. And so, you have to build yourself a buffer of time. And that really is 3 days or so before the actual drop dead date that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is talking about. So just so you have time for people to work through it.
So what should we be looking for here? Meeting starts a half an hour from now. We feel like we've seen this movie before, but there could be some different wrinkles. I suspect that Speaker McCarthy will talk to reporters in the driveway. It's been suggested that if he does not, that might be a sign of progress. He goes back to Congress and talks to reporters there.
It could be. I mean, I think that at this point, they're really just trying to come up with, just firm up the contours of a deal. And it's such a tricky moment because you have to remember President Biden just came back from Japan late last night. The clock is ticking. Lawmakers want to also go home for the long weekend, although sometimes that deadline pressure definitely helps. Yeah. But they're trying to hammer out a deal on spending caps, spending for the future. And those are things that, Democrats are reluctant to accept.
And of course, we're talking here, Enda, about getting a deal done before the default date. But there's also a question of how closely to that potential date you can get without otherwise getting in trouble.
Yep, so I was looking at the Economist reaction today. Goldman Sachs say 70% chance of a deal on both the debt ceiling and on spending cuts they expect. So there's kind of a sanguine view among the market watchers in all of this. But to your point, all of the economists are agreeing with the Treasury estimate that the Treasury will run out of money pretty soon in June. And by the way, even before it gets to a default, they make the point you don't have to default. They could run out of money to pay for wages, for the civil service, for the veterans, for everybody else on the government payroll. And that itself will be very damaging. I mean, the Treasury Secretary is warning about hit to sentiment, for example. This
is why Chairman McCarthy, or McHenry, is saying this got to be done in the next 24 hours here. The odds of that happening, I'm guessing, are not great. So do we then return to the conversation about a short-term solution? If at least there are the elements of a deal in place here, the framework, then you like to think that the parties might be open to saving the day with a short-term deal, then they can actually hammer out the details.
Well, I can tell you the markets and the economists following this are all saying, yes, the politicians won't go over the edge and allow default. There will be some kind of a deal, but of course, what kind of a deal, I guess, is the critical question.
And then, of course, if we don't get a deal, there's also the other options potentially that are out there, including one we're hearing more about, it seems, the 14th Amendment. Yet President Biden doesn't actually seem confident, Nancy, that that would work as intended, even if he does have the authority to use it, that all the legal mess wouldn't be figured out in time to actually avoid a default.
Yeah, I think that they're worried about sort of the legal rationale of that. And you have seen them take sort of bold legal action, like with the student debt cancellation. We don't know. That's at the Supreme Court. We don't know what's going to happen with that. So I think that that would be sort of a real moment of last resort for the Biden administration to lean on that.
We should hear from the Speaker of the House as he prepares to get to the White House. This is Kevin McCarthy talking earlier today.
We can get a deal tonight, we get a deal tomorrow, but you've got to get something done this week to be able to pass it and move it to the Senate. I think the Senate could probably act faster than I thought in the past, but we're going to need a couple days to write it and to make sure that everyone's able to read it and vote on it.
What can he do, Enda? What can the president do to make this different than the last meeting? People have started to think we're crazy. We're having the same conversation every day here. We've been talking about the elements of the deal, from clawing back COVID funding to permitting reform to work requirements. You think that they might be closer than we're actually giving them credit for?
Well, I would imagine there needs to be a message from the White House that there is a deal likely on the debt ceiling that kicks it well down the road, that removes this as a near-term concern for the local markets and the US economy, and of course an agreement on the spending side of things as well, so that this is removed as a political risk when people are looking at the US. Remember, one of the big talking points out of all of this is can the US really default, and what would that mean for treasury markets, which is the world's deepest financial market?
And of course, as all of this is playing out, we have to keep in mind that President Biden is running for re-election. He wants to be elected again in 2024. And the field that could oppose him is getting more and more crowded. Tim Scott formally making his announcement today, the senator from South Carolina. And Nancy, before the end of this week, we expect Ron DeSantis is going to officially throw that hat in the ring as well. Yeah,
we're expecting Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to make an announcement midweek, likely with some sort of video announcement, putting out his candidacy. He'll also have to file a FEC election filing. And then he's going to meet with a bunch of donors in Miami, Florida, where they're going to start raising money for a campaign. And so we're just seeing the GOP field become much more crowded now. And the thing is, if there is sort of any economic uncertainty, that's something that they're really going to try to capitalize on.
Let's hear from Senator Tim Scott in the big rollout today in South Carolina.
Under Joe Biden, we have become a nation in retreat. They say opportunity in America is a myth, and faith in America is a fraud. But the truth of my life disproves their lies.
This is an interesting sort of messaging that we're hearing from the senator, who has great respect on Capitol Hill, enjoys great respect. As Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump try to out-MAGA each other, does that leave a lane open for him?
Well, it does, and I think that the lane that he's trying to occupy is one of a different tone and one of more optimism. I think that on a lot of their policies, the Republican candidates largely agree on a lot of things about inflation, education, immigration, but really he's trying to just sound different and have a different message. The other interesting thing about Senator Scott is he is pretty popular with Wall Street donors. Yeah. And so out of all of sort of the second tier candidates that we're seeing who are polling, below 5%, let's say, he has sort of the most money to play with so far. And so I think he's definitely one to watch and could last in the race a bit longer just because he has that money.
Yeah, a bigger war chest. And we know Larry Ellison was there in South Carolina for his announcement
today. Not to mention
today.
A guy named John Thune, a pretty important introduction, if we can call it endorsement today. The question is anyone paying attention? This is a pretty tough week to be timing campaign announcements, Kaylee.
Yeah, the news cycle certainly isn't working in your favor if you're trying to get the maximum amount of attention possible, because, again, there's a pretty big high-profile meeting about to happen at the White House.
How true. We'll be talking a lot more about that as we make our way through this hour. Many thanks to Nancy Cook and Enda Curran. We thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up, we continue the conversation on the debt ceiling. Negotiations underway here and a meeting about to begin. Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland will be with us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are set to meet at the White House in just moments as debt ceiling talks continue and the X date rapidly approaches. Joining us now is Democratic Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland to discuss. Senator, thank you very much for your time. Within the last hour, we got a new letter from Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to congressional leaders in which she now said it is highly likely that the government may not be able to meet all of its obligations by as early as June 1st. So the window is narrow here to get a deal done to avoid a default. Can you commit to voting yes for whatever deal it is that President Biden agrees to?
Well, first, Kayleigh, it's good to be with you. We're very hopeful that we'll have a bipartisan agreement. We need that. We should never be threatening the full faith and credit of the United States in paying our bills. We are way too close to going off the cliff. It would be catastrophic. I am optimistic that we'll have a bipartisan agreement, but Speaker McCarthy is going to have to make sure that he understands bipartisan means it's not just his way. And I hope we can do that. We shouldn't be negotiating on the debt ceiling. Let's get this done. Let's move on to the budget discussions.
Senator, it looks like some budget cuts are coming. The president indicating in Hiroshima that he is open to cutting spending. I know that you lead the Senate Committee on Small Business, and you've expressed concern that cuts in some areas here, as we look at a potential deal, could have a real impact on small entrepreneurs, their ability to get loans, for instance. What does a small entrepreneur running a crab shack in Maryland have to worry about here?
Yeah. Well, Joe, the biggest fear is if we actually defaulted on our debt, interest rates would go up dramatically. Small businesses do not have a lot of choice on credit. It would make it a lot more expensive, and many small businesses would fold if we actually would go off the cliff. So that's the worst scenario. But if we reduce
what about cuts in a deal, though?
Yeah, if we reduce the support that we have for small businesses for access to capital under the Small Business Administration, that's also going to be extremely difficult for small businesses. We're coming out of the pandemic. We still have economic challenges for small businesses. They don't have the deep pockets. They need the programs that we put in place to help small businesses. And if we see a dramatic cut in those programs, it's going to have a very, very negative impact on small businesses.
So where would your red line be, Senator? Is it a level of spending cuts, work requirements, stricter work requirements for entitlements is something else we have heard from your Democratic colleagues? What's a deal breaker for you?
Well, I don't like to put red lines down. I think we have to listen to each other and we have to avoid this type of a crisis. I'm extremely disappointed the Republicans have taken us to this path and threatening to default on our debt. That shouldn't be there at all. We are where we are. Now we're going to have to look at, I hope, a true bipartisan agreement. I have confidence in President Biden. I have confidence in our Democratic leadership. I am certain that we will be as cooperative as we can to make sure we don't default. The president has other options, as you've already mentioned, perhaps under the Article 14 of our Constitution. The best solution right now is a bipartisan agreement.
It sounds like you have faith in President Biden to come up with a deal that you can vote yes on. To Kayleigh's question earlier, I wonder if you have concerns about work requirements or if it's spending levels, or if you say, Mr. President, hands off the wheel. Give us a deal that we can vote yes on.
Well, no, I certainly do have concerns about the subject matters being debated. I want to see this agreement before I'm going to make a commitment as to how I'm going to vote. But I do have confidence in the president. I don't think we should be in this position. Speaker McCarthy has put us in a position of threatening and holding literally our nation hostage. We shouldn't be in that position. So I think President Biden is certainly dealing with this crisis in a way that's in the best interest of our country to try to reach a bipartisan agreement, and I have confidence in the president.
It also raises the question of what happens if no deal is done today or in the coming days. Senator, we've already briefly touched on the idea of invoking the 14th Amendment, something the president himself seems to have questions on as to whether or not that would actually be effective and avoid a default. So what about a short-term race to the debt ceiling? Would you support that?
Well, absolutely. The worst case scenario is going off the cliff. The best case scenario is for a long-term extension of the debt limit so we don't have to do this again. But anything in between, whether the president uses his authority under the 14th Amendment or we have a short-term extension, is better than going off the cliff and actually defaulting on our debt.
We talk about top-line numbers here without addressing timeline, Senator. You've been through a couple of these things. Is it the amount of cuts, the size of budget cuts that will end up striking a deal here, or is it the duration of the deal that these two principles need to work out?
Well, I think it's all of the above. We should not be talking about the budget in conjunction with threatening the full faith and credit of the United States. So let me just make that clear. This is not the forum to talk about the FY24 budget. My guess is that we will get some direction on the FY24 budget in a bipartisan agreement. I don't know if we'll have all the details or not. That's what the budget process is about. And by the way, a budget needs to pass both the House and Senate. So Speaker McCarthy is going to have all the leverage he wants in regards to the FY24 budget. I expect we'll get some general direction if we have a bipartisan agreement. And we know the other subject matters they're talking about. Let's hope we can get a bipartisan agreement. Let's also hope we can then get a pathway for an agreement on the FY24 budget, which is very important for us to have an agreement. We recognize the Republicans control the House, Democrats control the Senate by a very narrow margin, and President Biden's in the White House. We need all parties together, working together in the best interests of our country. Get this debt ceiling issue off the table and let's negotiate in good faith a FY24 budget.
Well, and of course, the debt ceiling issue is on the table, but it's against a backdrop of other economic difficulties the U.S. is facing, a series of bank failures that we have seen. And to return to the point on small businesses and what you are hearing from small businesses in Maryland, what are they telling you about their ability to access credit right now? Are you concerned about a credit crunch, which a default in theory would exacerbate?
Oh, I'm very concerned about that. I'm concerned about the impact that just this threat has had on the availability of credit and the pressure it is on interest rates right now. For small businesses, they don't have a lot of avenues they can go down in order to get the credit they need. And if it becomes too costly, they don't have the deep pockets. It can literally put them out of business. So they've already had to go through a pandemic. Then we went through higher costs through an inflation, not just here, but globally. We had a supply chain challenge. They have workforce trying to get trained workers. Small businesses are really challenged today. And if we put on top of that the default on our credit so that the debt costs go up considerably, or we restrict their ability to have avenues of credit through the Small Business Administration, it's going to be much more impactful on our smaller companies, particularly those in traditionally underserved communities. So absolutely, I am very concerned about these negotiations and the impact it's having on small businesses.
Have we seen the worst, Senator? Is the banking crisis, if I can call it that, over?
Well, I think that we handled the circumstances pretty quickly in regards to the failed banks. We have not seen a hemorrhaging of other banks. So yes, from what I've been told, I think we're okay right now in regards to the stability of our banking system. The real threat right now is self-imposed, and that is the threat of not extending our debt limits. Let's hope we don't have that self-inflicted wound. But I do think our banking system is strong. I think we took immediate steps to make sure it stayed strong. So I'm not as concerned about the strength of our banking system as I am on getting the legislation we need in Congress to pay our bills and to negotiate then the FY24 budget.
Senator Ben Cardin, the Democrat from Maryland, we thank you, sir, for the time today on Bloomberg. Coming up, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott joins the party, becoming the newest Republican lawmaker to officially announce a candidacy for president. We're live from South Carolina next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott now in the running for president officially. Bloomberg's Christian Hall was at the big announcement this morning in Charleston, and he joins us right now. Christian, it's great to see you. Thanks for the great reporting today. I was struck by who else was there, including Senator John Thune, who introduced Tim Scott. What does that tell us about his mainstream chances?
Well, I think it says a lot about Senator Tim Scott. I mean, he had the second in power Republican at his event. Also there, the predecessor to Nikki Haley as governor, Mark Sanford. It was a really good turnout for Tim Scott.
Well, and it wasn't just politicians that turned out. There was some big money in the audience as well, including Larry Ellison, because, Christian, we understand that he already has a pretty big war chest, and a lot of big money backers are behind him on this, as I watch him dance on the screen.
That's very true. I mean, Tim Scott is a favorite of the donor class. He's also supported by politicians. Today in the audience, Larry Ellison was there. Now, Larry Ellison donated $30 million to Senator Tim Scott when he was running for Senate. So it is really to be seen how much money he's going to give him if he runs, well, in his run for president.
Just grabbing the most recent poll that I can here, Christian, Harvard-Harris poll on the Republican nomination. It's got Trump at 58, DeSantis at 16, Pence 4, Haley 4, Ramaswamy 4, and a man named Tim Scott at 1%. What does he do to improve name recognition? Why is he doing this?
Well, as you just said, name recognition. I think that is going to be the biggest challenge for Tim Scott. But Tim Scott is very popular in the state of South Carolina. He has the donor support, he has political support, but he also distinguishes himself from the others in the GOP primary with this message of unity and bringing the country together. So Tim Scott is really going to have to get out there and tell voters, look, if you don't want Trump or you don't want Trump light, vote for me.
Yeah, and of course, Joe, he also, during his announcement, multiple times referenced the radical left and President Biden, so trying to contrast himself with Democrats as well. Bloomberg's Christian Hall, great reporting from down there in South Carolina. Thank you so much. And now coming up, we're going to turn our focus back to the current president of the United States, President Biden, about to meet with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy at the White House. We are waiting for that to start in just a few minutes. We'll dig into these happenings with Rohit Kumar of PwC, the former chief of staff to Senator Mitch McConnell, who helped negotiate the 2011 deal. Next, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
First, we weren't making progress, then we made a lot of progress, and then all of a sudden, they came back with a proposal that was very cut back from where they had agreed. We are willing to cut spending as well as raise revenue so people start paying their fair share.
That was President Biden this weekend answering a question posed to him by our very own Anne-Marie Horadern, who is here, in Tokyo, but she joins us now on the show from a whole world away. Anne-Marie, of course, you are coming off of a very eventful couple of days at the G7 summit. It is from that President Biden is entering the talks at the White House, which are set to begin any moment from now. What else did we learn from the summit in Hiroshima?
Well, certainly the debt ceiling loomed large for the president. It also meant he had to cut his trip short here in the Asia Pacific. He was supposed to go to Papua New Guinea. He was supposed to go to Australia. But then he said to me, I hope that we can finally get a deal if I'm sitting face to face with Speaker McCarthy. And then these two are going to be doing that momentarily. Of course, outside of the debt ceiling, the other big topic for the president and for the other G7 leaders, of course, was China. And we got a communique that was actually pretty tough when it comes to the language, but how much in terms of tangible actualities we can see from this language, that still remains a question. One of the biggest takeaways I have seen, and really what potentially we see is a narrowing in terms of the gap, the transatlantic gap we had from the United States and the European allies, was how far they want to go in calling out China. And really what the new mantra is at this G7 is that they're not decoupling from China. They're quote unquote de-risking. And this is exactly what I asked the president's deputy national security advisor for economic affairs, Mike Pyle. I said, what's the difference? Take a listen.
When it comes to the core principles that unify us, there is a really underlying common approach. Again, you sort of talk about de-risking, not decoupling. That's something leaders agreed to that they want to do together. And what that means is there are a set of places where we have concerns. Things like economic coercion, things like China's non-market policies and practices that distort the global playing field for all of our workers. Things like their desire to acquire the most advanced technology to advance their military capabilities. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still room for a broad economic relationship between China and the G7.
The issue is moments after the president came out and talked about China, he said in the press conference that he's just potentially, we're a short while away from some thawing of relationships. He said to a question I asked him about the defense minister of China, if they would potentially lift sanctions on that individual, which would really lift a huge barrier for him to potentially meet his counterpart in the United States, Secretary Lloyd Austin. China came out and said one of the U.S.'s biggest companies failed a cyber review. So there's really a huge tit for tat continuing to go on between Washington and Beijing, even though you continuously see this administration bombard Beijing with requests to sit down with their Chinese counterparts.
Anne-Marie, many thanks for checking in and great reporting over the weekend. Anne-Marie Horduran with us from Tokyo, Japan. We thank you for being with us here. As always, Anne-Marie will be back with us in Washington later on this week. Joining us now to extend this conversation, particularly about the debt ceiling matter, is Rohit Kumar, principal at PwC, former domestic policy director, former deputy chief of staff for Senator Mitch McConnell. Rohit, it's great to have you here. You told Bloomberg last month that we should all be emotionally prepared for this to go to the brink. Are we there now?
We are very close to the brink, but we are not yet at the brink. In 2011, we didn't cut the deal until about 72 hours before the so-called X date, which back then was Tuesday, August 2nd. Now we've got it as Thursday, June 1st. So, we're getting into the sort of final sort of trenches of this thing, but, they don't have to cut the deal tonight. It would be great if they did. It would be fantastic. It would actually exceed the 2011 benchmark. But even if they just cut the deal in the next couple of days, that would be sufficient to get it done in time to avoid defaulting on our debt. But as I said a month ago, we should all be prepared. We should have all been prepared for it to go down to the wire. And indeed, it looks like it will.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, getting a deal between the president and the speaker is really just step one. It then needs to get through Congress. And frankly, the majority of this Congress was not sitting in the Capitol during the 2011 episode. There are a lot of new members. The composition of both chambers looks quite different. Perhaps the House, most importantly, are we underpricing the risk that this goes wrong, even if the president and the speaker can agree to a deal, that something goes awry and we may hit the cliff or go over it anyway?
Look, if they actually reach an agreement, Speaker McCarthy and President Biden reach an agreement, I spend very little time worrying about whether or not it will have the votes to pass the House and the Senate. These deals are to some degree self-policing. Speaker McCarthy is not going to strike a deal that he doesn't think can get at least a majority of House Republicans. President Biden's not going to strike a deal that he doesn't think that he can deliver a substantial number of House and Senate Democrats. And look, just like in 2011, at the end of the day, the loudest, most partisan voices at each extreme just aren't going to be a part of the coalition of the willing that's going to vote to get this thing to the president's desk. They're going to vote no. They're going to complain about the concessions that were made. That was true in 2011. They get a lot of attention because they are very loud and they say, newsworthy things. But at the end of the day, they're not really relevant to the underlying transaction, which is how is a bill going to become a law in the sort of divided government that we have now.
Yeah, we were singing Schoolhouse Rock a little bit earlier. Rohit, what about your former boss? Mitch McConnell has been very deliberate about making this between Speaker McCarthy and Joe Biden and keeping it that way when people come to ask him whether he should get involved or what his sense is. He says, I don't know, ask Kevin. They're going to work this out. Considering his experience, considering 2011, the number of times that he's been through this, can we assume that he's been whispering in Kevin McCarthy's ear, at least been a trusted advisor through this, or is he really keeping out of it?
Oh, no, I think that there is regular communication between the speaker and Leader McConnell. If you knew the layout of their offices, they are literally just around the corner from one another. It couldn't be more than 50 steps from one office to the other. What Senator McConnell has said, though, is, look, ultimately, what's going to become law is what can pass the Republican House of Representatives and be signed into law by a Democrat President, Joe Biden. And even in 2011, people seem to forget, or it's easy to forget, the negotiations began between then Speaker Boehner and President Obama. It wasn't until those negotiations fell apart that Senator McConnell and then Vice President Biden were called into service. And had these negotiations begun in January or February, as they did in 2011, then there might have been a possibility that a Speaker-President negotiation starts, doesn't yield a result, and then Senator McConnell steps in to negotiate the final resolution to the deal. But given the timeline under which these negotiations were operating, there wasn't really time to have a sort of failed initial set of negotiations and then some shuttle diplomacy, which is what we did in 2011. There just wasn't time for that. So if that was the desired sort of trajectory, then these negotiations needed to have started much earlier than they did.
Of course, all of us are still just chomping at the bit, waiting for a deal, regardless of what it looks like. But there is the matter of what it looks like, what the composition is of the compromise between the parties here. From your current seat at PwC, looking at tax services, how could it potentially alter the work you are doing? What do you think ultimately it's going to look like and the impact will be?
So I actually think in the tax space, I'm frankly not expecting much of anything to happen in terms of tax law changes. So the administration has said, how about all these revenue increases? House and Senate Republicans would not support that. I don't actually think House Republicans have put anything in terms of tax relief on the table, because that would, in theory, move the needle in the wrong direction. It would be deficit increasing, not deficit reducing. So I'm not expecting a lot of tax policy to be sort of enacted. And really, I'm not expecting any tax policy to be enacted as a part of this transaction. I think if we see tax policy changes, and I expect we will at some point this year, that happens later in the year, maybe in the fall around the government funding deadline, September 30th, or maybe even later than that, sometime between Thanksgiving and the end of the year. And so while you would expect the administration, as they've done even today, to continue to put out, hey, we're ready to raise a whole bunch of taxes to help reduce the budget deficit, there's just not the votes for that in the House or in the Senate. I don't think you would get 60 votes in the Senate. I don't think Speaker McCarthy would agree to it, let alone could it pass the House.
Yeah, he has suggested he does not want to look at any revenue-raising measures. Really just spending cuts is what he's looking at to address the deficit at this point. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rohit. Really great to get your insight and perspective on what really may be going on inside the room. That's Rohit Kumar of PwC. Now, coming up, we will turn to our political panel. They'll be here to weigh what we know and what we don't know yet about the debt ceiling discussions that should be going on right now at the White House. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm John Hyland. The Kremlin says Russian forces are battling attackers who crossed over the border from Ukraine. It's the second such incursion reported by Moscow in 2 months. A Kremlin spokesperson says President Vladimir Putin received reports from the defense ministry and security officials about the attack by what they call Ukrainian saboteurs. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is facing yet another cabinet scandal and a Conservative Party finger-pointing over soaring migration numbers. Sunak will consult his ethics advisor on whether Home Secretary Suella Braverman violated the ministerial code over her handling of a speeding ticket last year. Braverman reportedly asked civil servants to help arrange a private driving awareness course to prevent her speeding violation from becoming public knowledge. TikTok is suing the state of Montana amid its ban of the app. The social media giant says the state has trampled free speech rights. The company's legal challenge to the ban follows a suit filed just last week by a group of content creators who say the law violates their First Amendment rights and will disrupt their livelihoods. The new Montana law will impose the broadest and strictest limitations on use of the social media platform yet. And New Yorkers will soon be coughing up more money to get into and around the city. The Metropolitan Transport Authority is planning to boost its subway bus fares and tolls in August in order to help close budget deficits. A single ride would likely increase by 15 cents to $2.90. Toll crossings would increase by as much as 10% without an Easy Pass or as much as 7% with one. The increases would be the first since 2019 when the MTA avoided boosting such fees during the pandemic. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Originals. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm John Hyland, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. The meeting at the White House between President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy scheduled for this hour. We have not heard whether it has started yet, but we are all eagerly anticipating the outcome. Joining us now is our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, Jeannie, just to start with you, obviously, as he gears up for this meeting, the president has literally just returned from the G7 summit in Japan. So I wonder optically, depending on the outcome, if we don't get a deal or tangible forward progress, is it going to reflect more poorly on him because he's been out of the country for the last several days?
You know, it's hard to tell. Looking at the latest polls, the American public still saying it's pretty much evenly split in terms of blame. Historically, people go back and forth. I have been of the, fighting with my friends, I will say. I really do believe that in the end, it's bad news all around. But I do think the president bears blame, not necessarily for going to the G7, because I think everybody agrees critically important for the country. But I do think the president tends to be the one person we view as responsible for the economy, if anybody is. So if we see some really, really negative, like a default, I do think it's going to reflect really poorly on him. But the Republicans won't escape blame either. So, there's going to be a lot of blame to go around. God forbid that should ever happen.
Well, we can tell you now that the meeting has begun. They're in the room, Rick. We're off and running. So how do they make it different this time? The whole point last time for Kevin McCarthy was to tell everybody that they were far off. There's no deal in the works here. Some thought it was a bit of posturing, a bit of negotiating through the reporters who were there. The market's listening pretty closely, much more closely this time than last. What does he need to say to at least make the appearance that they're moving the ball?
Yeah, it seems to be a lot of the hang-up is over, whether or not we're going to reduce the spend for the next 2 to 5 to 7 years. And the president's plan was to just steady state FY23. So fiscal year 23 won't go up. And that was his proposal. And, of course, that's a non-starter when you started the process saying we're going to cut spending, right, back to 22 levels. So if they can overcome that hitch, right, and that's not an insignificant hitch, but if they can get to the point where the president actually is prepared to cut the budget and McCarthy is prepared to take the level of cut that he's prepared to go to, then I think we could have, a pretty good outcome today. But I can't imagine it's anything but that kind of general conversation that starts with, hey, we're not going to get out of this room unless I've got a commitment for a legitimate cut, back to 22 levels.
Well, they are saying a few things in the room ahead of the doors closing. President Biden saying he's optimistic we're going to get something done, that we talked about the need for a bipartisan agreement. We need to cut spending. We should be looking at tax loopholes. And then Speaker McCarthy saying we both agree we need to change the trajectory because, as we all know, that clock is ticking pretty loud and pretty fast. And Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is making sure everybody is reminded of that. It then becomes, though, Rick, say that they can agree they need to cut spending. They are going to compromise somewhere in the middle. The question of selling this to Congress. We were just speaking with Rohit Kumar, who helped negotiate the 2011 deal. He said, they're not going to agree to anything that they don't think they can get past their respective parties. Is that really true? This is a different Republican Party, a different House than it was 12 years ago.
Yeah, and the margins were a little more forgiving for Republicans in those days than they are today. And I think that the reality is, as the president said from Japan, if you want a bipartisan bill, you actually have to have a bipartisan outcome. And that means that whatever we agree to, we all both go lock, stock, and barrel together to Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and say to the Republicans and the Democrats alike, you will vote for this. Now, you're going to lose the fringes of the party. The liberal left isn't going to vote for it because it cuts spending, and the conservative right, the Freedom Caucus won't vote for it because they never vote for raising the debt limit. So why should that be any different? And you could get an overwhelming number. But the idea that McCarthy can't actually get his caucus to vote for whatever comes out of here is a problem for him. It means that he can't take something back and look at the president and say, I can get this done if you say yes. It's just not true. I
want to go back to the headline that Kayleigh just mentioned here, Jeannie. Joe Biden talking now, not Kevin McCarthy. We need to cut spending. Can we say today that he's changed his position on this?
You know, I don't think so. The president has acknowledged that we do need to be careful, that deficits have gone way up. You know, it's a question of when you say cut spending is pretty sort of
but
generic.
He proposed his budget already.
He did propose his budget, and it did confront the deficit. So he does want to handle and deal with spending. He does need to do that. So I don't think this is a shift for the president. But the difficulty for the president is it's not only got to be bipartisan, it's got to be bicameral. And he is facing, you know, you look at Elizabeth Warren, as she said over the weekend, you know, there is a line I won't cross here. He's also got to get this through the Senate, and he's got to get it through the progressive Democrats. Right. And that is going to be a challenge from his end as well. So the question is going to be, how much spending are you going to cut? And where are those cuts? Because, of course, Republicans are saying, we not only don't want to cut defense, we want to raise defense spending. Mm-hmm. And so for liberals, this is a real challenge.
We keep asking these same questions. Coming up, U.S. Senator Tim Scott formally entering the 2024 presidential race. Big event today in South Carolina. We'll be back with our political panel to discuss that and a lot more on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
Joe Biden and the radical left are attacking every single rung of the ladder that helped me climb. And that's why I'm announcing today that I'm running for president of the United States.
That was Senator Tim Scott formally entering the 2024 presidential race earlier today. For more, we reassemble our political panel. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Great to have you both here. He did quite a bit of screaming after that. He gave Howard Dean a bit of a run for his money here. But, Rick, I'll start with you as a Republican. Where's the lane? If he's pulling 1% in national polls, I realize it's early and it's national, but he's going up against a couple of titans here in Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. How does he crack that?
Yeah, he's kind of carving his own lane, right? Yeah. He's going to be an evangelical conservative who is the nice guy lane. And that's not always a successful lane to be in. But he's going to be well-funded. I mean, he starts with a good amount of cash to begin his campaign. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to show up and do well in Iowa, New Hampshire, and, you know, sort of check that box on retail politics. And he will. I mean, he's a very gregarious, very nice guy. I think that you're going to see a lot of positives in his campaign early on. The question is, can he convert that good feeling into political strength and also polling? Because he's going to need some good polling in order to make sure he's in the debates and he's not written out early in this process.
But to your point about him being well-funded, we know Larry Ellison was in the audience when he made this announcement today in South Carolina. He has a lot of people that like him on Wall Street. And so I wonder in the donor race, especially as we've heard that donors are proving reluctant to actually give money to Ron DeSantis, could that actually be something that ultimately is a maker or a breaker for everyone that's not Donald Trump?
It certainly could. First of all, I loved his dancing, and I just have to say, and I loved the music. So, you know, I do think he is very attractive. We saw, you know, the establishment support from people like John Thune. You hear, you know, really positive things from his colleagues in the Senate. But to your point about big donors and Wall Street, he is a very attractive candidate. His biography, his time in the Senate, the conservative policies. The one criticism I have, well, I have a few, but one of the main ones I have from today, he talked about his bio. He talked about attacking the Democrats and Biden and the radical left. But he's first got to get through Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. There's a race to be run first, and that's for the primary. And if he's not going to attack Donald Trump, who was very welcoming of him to the race today, then I'm not sure how he gets there. So to me, he's going to have to go hard against them in order to find a way. Can he do that if he's Mr. Optimistic?
Yeah, when you're congratulated and welcomed to the race by Donald Trump, it does kind of make you wonder your position in the universe here. Rick and Jeannie, we thank you as always. Great conversation with our political panel. And Kaylee, the meeting is underway now. It's just a question of how long this might go on, and we'll encourage everyone to stay with us on Bloomberg TV for more.
Yep, of course, Bloomberg will have full coverage. And for more coverage of all things Washington, make sure you're checking out our Washington Edition newsletter. That is both on the terminal and online. We're taking a look here at a live shot of the White House where these key debt ceiling conversations are taking place. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Biden in conversation. Stay tuned. Thanks for joining us. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.